Hey everyone, and welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we are diving deep into an absolute masterpiece of historical nonfiction. We're doing a complete book summary review of Barbara W. Tuchman's classic, The Guns of August. If you've ever found yourself wondering how the entire world somehow managed to just plunge itself into one of the most devastating conflicts in human history, well, you are definitely in the right place. Tuchman's book meticulously details the inevitable unraveling of peace, and today we're going to break down exactly how that happened using the source material to guide us through all the chaos.
But before we even touch the battlefields, I want you to think about this kind of crazy mystery. How did a single royal funeral foreshadow a global catastrophe? Seriously, just a few short years before the horrific violence of World War I, the monarchs of Europe gathered in this incredible, solemn pageantry. I mean, it looked like the absolute pinnacle of unity and tradition. So how did we get from that picture-perfect moment of peace to total destruction?
All right, let's just dive right in. Here's our roadmap for today's explainer. We'll start with the fragile illusion of peace, then look at the rigid blueprints for war, the unstoppable chain reaction, the collision on the Western Front, the Eastern Front, and naval clashes, and finally, the devastating stalemate.
Section 1. The Fragile Illusion of Peace. So Tuchman actually kicks off this book not with gunfire, but with this incredibly deceptive, almost ironic calm. In May 1910, the grand funeral of Britain's King Edward VII brought together representatives of dozens of European royal families. Tuchman uses this brilliant symbolic prelude to illustrate the collapse of the old world order. It was a beautiful display, for sure, but beneath the surface, it highlighted a super fragile peace that was maintained merely through personal diplomacy and intricate family alliances.
When you consider who was actually there, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, and King George V of Britain, they were all linked by blood and personal ties. You'd think this interconnectedness would guarantee peace, right? But as Tuchman points out, these personal relationships actually masked a really dangerous atmosphere of complacency. The leaders severely underestimated the potential for a massive, large-scale conflict because they just assumed their family ties and complex alliances would keep everything in check.
Moving on to Section 2, Rigid Blueprints for War.
See, while the royals were leaning on those family ties, their military bureaucracies were doing something completely different behind the scenes. Tuchman shifts our focus to the cold, calculating military planning of the era. On one side, you have Germany's Schlieffen Plan, on the other, France's Plan 16. And right alongside them, Russia was drafting its own massive mobilization plans. What Tuchman really hammers home here is the sheer inflexibility of these strategies. They were essentially giant, unalterable railway timetables. Once mobilization was ordered, these plans left absolutely zero room for diplomatic solutions. Let's break down the most critical one here. The Schlieffen Plan was basically Germany's strategic blueprint, designed specifically to rapidly execute a two-front war against both France and Russia. It was highly calculated, like a mechanistic engine that assumes certain timings and troop movements right down to the hour. And as Tuchman points out, it relied heavily on commanders like General von Moltke, whom she critiques for lacking the absolute nerve required to execute a plan of this magnitude. It's this exact rigidity, fueled by military bureaucracy and a total lack of coordination among European powers, that completely sets the stage for the tragedy.
Section 3, The Unstoppable Chain Reaction.
So, the blueprints are locked in. All they needed was a spark. And wow, did they get one in late June 1914 with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary. What follows in July is a massive diplomatic crisis. Actually, scratch that, crisis doesn't quite cover it. Tuchman's narrative captures the terrifying, blinding speed of this thing. Because of endless misunderstandings and rapid miscalculations, Europe totally teetered on the brink. By August 1914, that fragile peace we talked about completely unraveled. It was a runaway train. The absolutely crucial point here is how unbelievably fast a localized conflict exploded globally. A fight strictly between Austria-Hungary and Serbia quickly triggered this tangled web of treaties. Those treaties rapidly drew in Russia to defend Serbia, which pulled in Germany to support Austria-Hungary, which subsequently dragged in France and Britain. It was an unstoppable domino effect where no one felt they could hit the brakes. Which brings us to Section 4. Collision on the Western Front. This is the exact moment those neat, tidy paper plans slammed into the brutal reality of the battlefield as Germany executes the Schlieffen Plan. Step 1, the swift invasion of neutral Belgium and Luxembourg to get to France, but the sheer arrogance of this planning was quickly checked. The Germans literally never expected the Belgians to actually fight back. Step 2 brings us to the grueling siege of Liège.
And step 3 culminates in the massive Battle of the Frontiers. The German war machine attempted to roll over its enemies on a super strict schedule, but as you can guess, things did not go exactly as planned.
And Tuchman gives us this absolutely gripping account of the human element resisting these cold, calculated blueprints. There was defiant resilience from the Belgian and French forces. Even though they were vastly outmatched by the German war machine, their defense was just relentless. Add to this the critical intervention by the British Expeditionary Forces, or BEF. Though small in number, they played a massive part in crucially slowing down the German advance at the Battle of Mons. These incredible, against-all-odds human efforts drastically altered Germany's grand timelines.
Section 5. Eastern Front and Naval Clashes. Now, while the Western Front was literally exploding, the rest of the continent and the high seas were also being plunged into total chaos. Over on the Eastern Front, the Russian army launched a massive invasion of East Prussia. Tuchman draws a stark comparison for us here. On one hand, you have the Russian army, plagued by petty personal rivalries, most notably this bitter, ridiculous feud between Generals Rennenkamp and Samsonov, and just completely poor coordination. On the flip side, you have the German army, operating with incredible efficiency and tactical brilliance under Generals Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff. This brilliantly illustrates the deadly cost of poor leadership and communication when you're faced with a highly organized opponent. In all of that disparity in leadership, it completely came to a head at the Battle of Tannenberg. Tuchman frames this as a huge, pivotal moment on the Eastern Front. The Germans delivered an absolutely crushing defeat to the Russians here, heavily punishing their miscalculations and demonstrating just how undeniably vital effective communication is in warfare. Right around the exact same time, the conflict spilled over into the oceans. The British Royal Navy and the German Imperial Navy were locked in a massive struggle for vital naval supremacy. Tuchman spends these thrilling chapters detailing the escape of the German battlecruiser Goeben, which was this crazy naval blunder with massive geopolitical consequences. We also see major engagements like the Battle of Heligoland Bight. Tuchman details the devastating impact that naval blockades had on the outcome of the war. Plus, this period marks the early stages of submarine warfare, an evolving tactic that began aggressively disrupting global trade and supply lines, really expanding the conflict's reach across the entire globe.
Finally, Section 6, the devastating stalemate.
So the plans were executed, the massive armies collided, and the result, well, it was pure horror. As the initial momentum on the Western Front started to slow down, both sides began these desperate maneuvers to outflank each other in a series of relentless, grueling movements known as the Race to the Sea. This culminated in horrific clashes like the First Battle of Ypres. Ultimately, these flanking attempts failed completely, and the armies just locked each other into a bloody, unmovable standstill. Tuchman really captures the grim reality of what these grand, arrogant plans actually achieved out there. The sheer, unimaginable horror of trench warfare. We see enormous, totally unprecedented casualties. Suddenly, minor, seemingly insignificant geographic locations gained massive strategic importance, and they were paid for in blood. This permanent stalemate came to define the Western Front. The initial arrogance of the leaders who thought the war would be quick, orderly, and over by Christmas was quite literally buried in the mud and blood of the trenches. To really summarize this book review of such a masterful piece of work, we have to return to Tuchman's core thesis, which is captured beautifully in the spirit of this quote. The fragile peace, held together merely by personal diplomacy, was ultimately shattered by the utter rigidity of military plans and a totally blind atmosphere of complacency. It is the tragic, heartbreaking irony of the Guns of August. These meticulously planned security guarantees and hyper-detailed military blueprints didn't protect nations at all. They served as the exact mechanism that led directly to mass slaughter. So, as we wrap up today's explainer, I want to leave you with a bit of a provocative thought. When do our own rigid plans and lack of communication leave no room for diplomacy today? Whether we're looking at modern geopolitics or just everyday leadership in our own lives, the lessons of 1914 are still incredibly relevant. You know, when we build systems so rigid that they cannot be stopped once set in motion, we basically invite catastrophe. Thank you so much for joining me for this summary of the Guns of August, and I'll see you in the next explainer.